Thank you. I'm going to deal with how we have a better way to do relationships. And I think to start with, that title assumes that we need a better way. There's something wrong with the way we've been doing it up until now. And as I was thinking about this, it came to mind that how many of us, growing up in youth groups or churches all over this fine land, how many of us actually went through a sermon or a talk about relationships? I'm not even just talking about dating relationships, even just sharing life together, friendship. How did that go if you had one? It seems that we've skipped the whole delight of being friends and being in relationships with people and got straight to the sex talk. That seems to be the model that has been laid out. And talking of that sex talk, how was that if you got one? Was it just a simple, don't do it? Was it a youth worker producing a mannequin and tell you where and where not is okay to touch? I mean, how did that go? Did your parents talk about sex at home? How did that go? Because perhaps you grew up in an environment where relationships were talked about a lot, but I think that some of us didn't have that experience, and therefore that left us feeling with this complex issue that we don't really know what we're doing. And the result of that, in my view, has meant that many of us actually have a limited understanding of what we think of when we think of relationships. We think that our lives are somehow incomplete until we find Mr. or Mrs. Right. And to help us find them, the advice that's often given is just to pray. To pray that your paths will cross. And until that moment, you need to learn to become content in yourself. And then God will provide that person for you. If that does happen and we do meet that person, once we start to date, rather than enjoying each other's company and getting to know them, we need to invest all of our energy into making sure that we don't have sex. Whether it's the classic don't touch what you don't have rule, or whether it's touch nothing below the neck, whatever it is, we have to discern those boundaries by having the boundaries conversation. And so we started going out with someone, and before we learn who their favourite Thomas the Tank Engine character was when they grew up, we have to have a very in-depth, prayer-filled conversation about our sexual boundaries. And heaven help us if we do mess up. Even that term, mess up. Imagine having to go to your youth leader or your church leader to confess that actually you are, or maybe were, just a horny little teenager. Imagine the shame. Psalm 51 is prescribed. If, however, we do make it to marriage with managing not to tear each other's clothes off, we're then expected to make this huge mental and emotional jump from no sex, no sex, no sex to sex. All of a sudden that's permissible, that's allowed, that's okay, we're allowed to do this is normal, this is good. God endorses this, even though for our whole going out time He has forbidden it. How do we manage those emotions? How do we manage those expectations? See, the fact that we haven't had advice on that, I think that results in many of us feeling confused, bewildered, maybe even helpless when it comes to relationships. And perhaps I'm exaggerating for emphasis, but I think there is enough evidence to suggest that many of us didn't get the advice or the help or the direction that we needed when it came to relationships. Let alone any hints or tips on how we cope with our changing culture, in which it is normal now to wait longer before we get married, and therefore we prolong celibacy. So how do we cope with that? In a world where the media is totally bombarding us with images and ideas about sex and relationships. In a survey that Love for Life carried out a few years ago with Evangelical Alliance and Summer Madness, we found out of just over 1,000 16 to 30-year-olds, we found that 53% of them gained advice on relationships and sex from the church. That's a good thing, over half. 87% of the people find that, or they believe that the Bible had something to teach them about relationships and sex. And those are good stats. That's a lot of people thinking that the Bible has something to say. But when I read that, I'm a bit sad. Where do 13% get their advice from if they don't think the Bible has anything to say about relationships? Where does the 47% who don't get their advice from the church, where do they get it from? 15% of people who took part in our survey who were either single or engaged and described themselves as having the highest level of commitment to church, 15% of that group had already had sex. 79% of blokes and 17% of females said that they accessed online porn, even though 76% of people said that porn damaged relationships. See, I think it's clear that the way we, the Christian community, have been doing relationships has had some great successes. It really has. but there is definite room for improvement. And I think actually we need a whole shift in how we do relationships as contemporary Christians. And I believe it starts with a foundation of the biblical truth that God created us for relationships. He created it and it was good. Therefore, He knows the best design for those relationships. From that foundation, we then have to figure out how to learn to live that out in our day-to-day lives. So how do we experience and demonstrate grace in a way that transforms us? How do we help and equip other Christians to live in this world that is full of so much pressure to live a godly life? I think three things. Firstly, we need to talk about sex and relationships more, both in the positives and the negatives. And we need to talk about it not in a way that suggests that life without a relationship is an empty life or an unfulfilled life. But we need to talk about it in a way that helps people know that relationships are difficult. Therefore, struggles are okay. So if you're single and struggle with that, that's okay. Let's talk about it. If you're dating and struggling with that, that's okay. Let's talk about it. If you're married and struggling, shock horror, but if you're married and struggling, that's okay. Let's talk about it. See, we need our young people to learn from our way of living, that it is okay that not every relationship turns out like the movies. But actually, real joy, true intimacy comes from dealing with the difficulties as well as dealing from the wonderful times. So firstly, we need to talk. Secondly, I think we need to recognize that people within the church, us, we, make or have made choices that weren't the best things for us. We also need to recognize that people within our church haven't necessarily chosen the circumstances that they are in. So we need to recognize that people within the church watch porn. We need to recognize that people within the church sleep with people they're not married with. We need to recognize that people within the church are attracted to someone of the same sex as them. Therefore, what kind of communities are we creating? Are we creating events where turning up on your own is a terribly daunting thing? Are we actually talking about real life issues that affect everyday lives? Are our churches places where broken people feel like it's okay to be broken? Or are they places where broken people feel like they will get judged and they will get condemned because of the attitudes we hold and the language that we use? So we need to talk about it. We need to recognize that everybody struggles. And thirdly, most importantly possibly, we need to talk positively about sex and relationships. We worship a relational, a Trinitarian God who created us in His image to have relationships with other people. Imagine, therefore, if Christians talked about relationships and sex positively in our world, rather than just talking about them in terms of what is forbidden or condemned. Imagine if we celebrated the fact that virginity can be a choice that actually has emotional, physical, even spiritual benefits. Imagine if the church became a community of people who sacrificially, graciously give and share life together like they did in the second chapter of Acts. Imagine if Christians were known as those who brought joy and light into the darkness, rather than standing on the sidelines blaming the darkness for being dark. So what is a better way to do relationships? Firstly, I think we need a biblical understanding that God created us for relationships, and upon that foundation, we do three things. We talk about relationships more, we take away the taboo. Secondly, we recognize that everybody struggles, but we are all searching for greater and for more. And thirdly, we speak positively into our world that is so crying out for a voice of light and hope. Thank you.